hau ki te iwi nō rātou te mana I te whenua, nō reira e ngā tāngata whenua o tēnei takiwā, tēnā koutou o tira tēnā tātou katoa. My name's Peter Lucas Jones. I'm really happy to be here to share with you our journey. It is a tribal journey. It is an Indigenous journey of automatic speech recognition, speech technology built by the people that belong with the language, and that language was forcibly removed from the mouths of children through part of the white assimilation process in Aotearoa, the education system, and of course reconnecting people with language, with culture, with place. It's all part of the identity that I want to share with you today. Aotearoa. I'll just start that. So yeah, history has a strange way of repeating itself. I mean, everyone wants to be in control, everyone wants to make money, and unfortunately, as a tribal group, as a tribal station, we've observed that these sorts of things need to be carefully negotiated, particularly because we're trying to restore native sound and revitalise te reo Māori. So our whakapapa, who are we? We are Te Hiku Media. We're one of the 21 iwi radio stations in New Zealand, formed in 1991. And Te Hiku Media as an iwi organisation is a monument, along with the 21 other tribal stations, to those that were committed to having our rights and interests recognised in Aotearoa. And those are Indigenous rights and interests. So we've had 30 years of corpus gathering, creating content with our community and broadcasting in our tribal, our terrestrial tribal broadcasting area. I want to share a little bit of kōrero about Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Te Tiriti o Waitangi is the founding document of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and it is the teina document, or the junior document to what's known as Te Whakaputanga. And Te Whakaputanga is the Declaration of Independence that was signed by a number of chiefs some years before Te Tiriti o Waitangi was signed. But the purpose of the treaty was to protect Indigenous rights and interests, Indigenous property, and keep peace and order amongst the settlers. There was so much lawlessness amongst the white settlers that were coming into our territories. As the picture shows you, there's quite a few different pages there. There's actually 9 different pieces of paper that were signed over about 7 months, carried around the different tribal communities, and these were signed by different chiefs, but Te Tiriti o Waitangi is named after the place it was first signed. I really want to just share a little bit of context, because land alienation, cultural loss, cultural decline, and the marginalisation of Māori people in their own hometowns, on their own lands, in their own tribal territories, is what followed the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And you can't help but take on board the fact that Māori language was banned, and children were physically punished for using language at school, and this had a devastating consequence on intergenerational transmission of language and culture amongst families. So in 1975, the Waitangi Tribunal was established, and it kind of acts like a truth and reconciliation process. Now, fast forward to 1989, the government was wanting to sell state-owned broadcasting assets. Now, you're probably wondering, what does that all mean? Well, what that means for us is an extremely important time in our history. At that time, the Māori language claim was tabled before the government, and the outcome of a Privy Council case regarding the sale of that those state-owned assets, it had far-reaching consequences for Māori language in broadcasting. So in 1990, we also had a claim to recognise and protect the Indigenous interests and rights in radio frequencies. And there was a report by the tribunal on that claim. And so what's the purpose of iwi radio? Iwi radio stations are set up to promote the language, the Indigenous language of the communities that those stations belong to. And so iwi stations, they function both as a collective, te whakaruru hau o ngā reo irirangi Māori, of which there are 21 stations. And then, of course, they serve their individual tribal interests that have Māori language plans. These are plans that are focused on the revitalisation of language and culture. So rights to radio spectrum, that is a very big conversation in New Zealand, 3G, 4G, 5G, and you can learn more about that online. But the digital switchover for tribal stations has been a journey in its own self. And so what we've seen is that we are now seeing a huge number of our users connecting with us online. And so we've developed our own approach, which is to create our own platforms, rather than putting our content in YouTube or something like that, because we're mindful that the body of knowledge contained within our content belongs to the people that that language belongs to. And the language is the key to the culture. And so I just want to mention that the Kahu Fund resourced our initial efforts in our speech-to-text technology. I've got to look at that clock. Okay, Y262, that is the claim for intellectual property rights. There were 6 very well-known kaumātua elders that put forward this claim, and it focuses on the protection of our treasures, one of which was recognised earlier with Y11. The Māori language claim was recognised as a taonga or a treasure, and all of those taonga are guaranteed protection under Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So the claim's purpose was to address ownership, issues surrounding Māori knowledge, and of course any commercialisation of anything, any products that were to be derived from that knowledge is certainly something of interest for those people that are connected with this claim. So back to the iwi radio. Now, we've been collecting corpus for more than 30 years, talking about every river, interviewing our elders about every tree, speaking in our language, working with our people to document what was originally only passed down in an oral history format. So our interview style is very much an oral history interview style, also focusing on topical issues and current affairs. I mention this because at this point in our history, these tapes represent the storage of data, analog storage of data. Now, when we think about how we store data in an analog sense, we had VHS tapes, we had CD-ROMs, we had any way and every way of storing our data. And then, of course, when you start to digitize data, where do you store it? When you start to digitize data, how do you govern access? When you start to digitize data, how do you curate it? This gave rise to us developing our own digital platform that we could provide access to real-time content. Sound check, sorry, I don't want to hurt anyone's ears. So
Ka mutu I tēnei ono, ka titiro ke koe tō tātou kāwanatanga e tatu ana rani wetahi o enei kōrero.
they're talking about the new government in New Zealand and Indigenous programs on the line for funding cuts. But as you can see, what we wanted to do was have a digital presence. 86% of the members of our tribal groups do not live in our traditional areas. So whilst we had this huge body of knowledge that we've been curating and keeping very well catalogued over 30 years, very few people were able to access that content because they did not live in our terrestrial broadcasting area. Just going to the next thing, sorry guys. And so we started to interview people in language, particularly our elders, and film those interviews. We then spent hours and hours and days and weeks transcribing our language into a type of content that could be used for learning. Not educational content, but we know that being exposed to a language provides an opportunity for acquisition. So we were mindful that this provided a moment of acquisition, tagging and labeling, teaching people that spoke the language, not linguists, not anthropologists, not people that wanted to learn about us from us, but people that could teach us a tool. And that's the difference. And so it was a big job keeping people away and keeping this project unpolluted, keeping it uncontaminated by a philosophical worldview that did not belong in the work that we were doing. And so we tagged and labeled words, idiomatic expressions, colloquialisms, tagging them and providing explanations in the language. And we could not keep up with the amount of work that we had. So we decided we needed to teach computers how to speak te reo Māori. And the reason we did that is back to the why. Revitalization, preservation, and promotion of our language. We were also mindful that the government has an ambitious goal of 1 million Māori language speakers by 2040. Keeping that in mind, we were also mindful that we're probably 15% of New Zealand's population. So where were those million speakers going to be made up? They were probably going to be made up by people that we could change the hearts and the minds of. People that could get a sense of identity, a national identity for our country through language. We also wanted to create tech opportunities for Indigenous people. So our team is made up of Māori and other Pacific peoples. And so we took this opportunity to not just be the users of technology, but to be the developers of the technology that we required to accelerate our language revitalization efforts. And how did we do that? Well, we had a bit of a recipe. We used some open source tools, and we had a very, very passionate language community. I want to show you this now. So this is our first platform that we used, and we made a reading competition. And so that reading competition essentially meant that we would record something. Kia tere atu ki te āwhina I a rātou. And our platform required you to listen to it. Is that working? Well, theoretically it should just work. Kia whakarongo atu māua nei ko taringa. Anyway, you listen to it, and then if you like it, you can save that. One moment. Our competition also had a license. People had to opt in. There was no use participating if you didn't opt in. But for us, it was really important that everybody that participated in this reading competition was able to know and understand what this was being used for. So we of course had it in our own language and te reo Pākehā or English. And in 10 days, we gathered 316 hours of tagged and labelled language data, which for an Indigenous community, from what I understand, that is it's an exceptional effort, and everyone around the world that has seen what we created buzz out on that. They buzz out on that because how did you motivate those people? And I think when you have cultural knowledge and cultural intelligence, what it tells you is that community-led projects always have the best results. And so we looked at Orotuku Iho. What we found through that is people were using this web app that we created like a learning tool. But they wanted to know how could they get better. And what we found is that with Māori people, there was definitely some sort of intergenerational transmission of sound. There was some sort of archaeology of sound. We were calling it te whakapapa o te reo, the genealogy of the language. And we say, e hoki whakamuri ki a ngā whakamua, you have to go backwards to go forwards. So we wanted to better understand why sound was so important to our people when they associated a place with the identity of the tribal group. Taking on board that many people will say languages all evolve. But our language did not evolve naturally when it was getting beaten out of the mouths of our children. That was part of the assimilation process. So decolonizing the sound of our language and recognizing the influence of English pronunciation on the language was a point in our journey where we realized that we wanted to make a very real contribution to restoring native sound. And so we developed a pronunciation tool, and this tool helped us mark up sounds. Heoi, piria nā te arawa ki te kāwanatanga, tāna oatitanga mo tāna rohe. And then if that was incorrectly pronounced, we would mark up a phoneme. We would mark up a diphthong. We would mark up where three vowels might follow one another. We were taking into account how the characters were being represented, how the sound was being represented by the characters. And in this, we started to tag and label a pronunciation data for our pronunciation model. But who owns this data? See, that's the wrong question. From our tribal point of view, that is the wrong question, because that takes us to the Western ownership model. And we can't forget the privatization of Indigenous land and the way that history has a way of repeating itself. So what we took into account was that over 30 years we had developed trust and accountability in the community. So how might we license the data while maintaining sovereignty, taking into account those opportunities we wanted to grow people into, making the language available in the digital world, keeping in mind that without the language being in the digital world, there was not going to be any digital world. And if we get a digital place for the language, and if we give tech companies access to our data, does that mean the very people that beat the language out of the mouths of our children, our parents and our grandparents, were going to sell it back as a service? Wouldn't that be the biggest slap in the face? And Lionbridge was going to pay everybody $45 American an hour for reading Māori language sentences, but we weren't the only Indigenous community that were contacted. So too were the Native Hawaiians, the Kanaka Maoli people, and hosts of other Indigenous people throughout the Pacific. And we kind of wondered who was behind this all. And we understand that there is some connection there between different big tech companies. And then, of course, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this paper, but you have a data set that's here called the Flores data set. Now, this is one of those papers where, sometimes when you read a paper and it doesn't say where the data comes from, like for me, that just raises some red flags straight away. When we're dealing with Indigenous data, let's face it, how did these artifacts get into the museum, the library, and the gallery anyway? Let's face it, there were scavengers out there in the communities picking up bones, the heads of our great-great-grandparents and whatever, we're still repatriating them. Well, this is an unusual situation that reminds us of that sort of circumstance. And what I'm saying is, when we evaluated the Te Reo Māori data set that is part of this particular data set, it only had 4 speakers. And despite that, the paper claiming that they were native speakers, when we listened to those recordings, they were certainly not native speakers. So what I'm talking about is quality. When a language has been harmed so much through colonization, one of our principles is do no harm. Do no harm. And we felt that this approach actually promotes harm to a language that is identified as perhaps one of the 6,000 languages that will be extinct by 2050 if we do not act with urgency. So there are issues with OpenIA's Whisper as well. I mean, it's the same sort of situation, unclear where the data comes from, benchmark on FLIRs. I mean, for me, that's an issue because surely there's another way of thinking about this, a better future for AI. So we've developed our Kaitiakitanga data license. It's an Indigenous data license that upholds a set of principles that we believe not only build capability and capacity, but ensure accountability. Accountability back to the people that the language belongs with, whilst maintaining data sovereignty. And so we prohibit through our license any use of our technology that will persecute, that will harm. It's not to be used for surveillance of our Indigenous people. All these types of things. And we get people to commit to an affirmative action when they want to access our API or our data. So I'm just mindful, like my talk's getting shorter, so bear with me. So there are a bunch of things that we've created. I'll just show you our speech to text, taihoa. Tēnā koutou e ngā iwi I haere mai ki tēnei wāhi I te whenua moemoea I tēnei rā. My name is Peter Lucas Jones, and I wanted to share with you how a tribal community taught a computer how to speak our language. Engari ko te mea ke, e mōhia nā hau, ko tā tātou whakamahi I te reo Pākehā I tēnei ao, tētahi o ngā huarahi, mahi moni. But we're mindful that we speak bilingually, and so the tool that we wanted to create needed to speak te reo Māori and English. The reason that we do this is we want to inspire other Indigenous people, and not only those tribal groups that neighbour us, because we believe that these sorts of projects should be Indigenous led. Oh, sorry, I forgot to open it again. Aroha mai. Okay, so that's that. We then, how much time do I have? Got a moment? Sweet. Okay, I think I've talked enough about the digital sovereignty and, of course, if we give access to our data, what that means. But I do want to just mention soft models. And the reason for that is you can see that there's always work to be done with these tools. But for us, we needed to know when something was good enough. And the way to find out that it's good enough is actually involving the best speakers of the language, which are those people that are speaking the language every day. Our transcribers knew what best was and what was good enough so that we could start to accelerate our data labeling problem. And that helped us build our automatic transcription web app, Kaituhi. That helps us to tag and label our idiomatic expressions and all that sort of stuff. Of course, this has our ASR in it. And alongside that is our data pipeline. So we created this app. Again, it has our license there. Ko te mana raraunga Māori te tāhuhu o tēnei whare, ka noho te mana o ngā taonga kei tēnei whare ki ngā kaitiaki, nō rātau anō ngā taonga tiaki nei nei taonga kaua e takahi, kaua e pokanoa. Welcome to the whare kōrero, which is the house of knowledge. This whare upholds the principles of Māori data sovereignty. All content remains under the guardianship of the original distributor. Respect this whare and the kōrero within it. Probably wondering, how do you legally uphold that? Well, we're still exploring that, but we want to be really clear that when people come to our platform to access the content of the tribal radio stations, it does not belong to us that built the whare, but it belongs to where that kōrero originated. And so as part of this, we developed a Māori pronunciation model. We then developed a Māori pronunciation app because the feedback from the people that were contributing to the reading competition, and you had to be in a group of 7, just back to the reading competition. It could not be an individual, because what we wanted to take into account is like this whole individual thing. It is not like the way that the collective ownership model works. So we needed people to participate in groups. We're also mindful that there's trauma associated with language loss, and many Māori people feel like, oh, I'm not a very good Māori, I can't speak Māori, I don't know my culture well enough, I'm being judged. I'm being judged because I'm not accelerating the same way that these 3 white people in my class are, because they don't have to feel like crap for not knowing the language. And so they get over humps at a different speed because they don't have the trauma associated with language loss and cultural decline within the family, the sub-tribe or the wider tribe. We took that into account. And we took that into account because we wanted to enable people to have an opportunity to learn at their own pace in the privacy of their own experience. And so that's why we launched Rongo, and we hacked a deep speech. Well, we're friends with Mozilla. Hey, thank you guys. And we get on well with them. And so we looked at how we could hack something up to measure pronunciation. And it's improving as our data is starting to improve as well, the tagging and labeling of the data. So our APIs are available. We've also done speech synthesis. And I'm just going to quickly show you that before I finish. So this is our speech synthesis. So our project is called Papareo. We're te rewirirangi o te Hiku o te ika, but it's really about enabling a sovereign future for language technology for Indigenous language groups. So you type in here, got to spell properly though. Got to spell. And being mindful that te reo Māori has had many different orthographies. We didn't have a written language. So since the coming of the missionaries and the needing to Christianize people, let's face it, the doctrine of discovery had a very, very big impact on the lives and deaths of many of the people across the Indigenous world. And so too did it have an impact on the way in which language was documented. Tēnā koutou. E ngā iwi I haere mai I te rānei. Okay,
A koutou e ngā iwi I haere mai I te rānei.
So that was our first effort. We then got in the studio and we did this with the female voice.
Koutou e ngā iwi I haere mai te rānei.
So you just write stuff in there and it basically converts it to our synthetic voice. We've also started working with our sister language groups. As you can imagine, the Pacific languages are related. There are the Eastern Polynesian language groups, of which Māori is a member. So we're mindful that we can accelerate efforts through working together. But I wanted to share that story with you guys today because it's a story that is not just about developing technology. It's about connecting people with an identity that was forcibly removed from their families. And so from our point of view, data sovereignty is really important because if you don't have control of the data, we can forget that data is land. Data is land. And like our kuia Whina Kupa said, not one more acre. Kia ora tātou. Thank you for having me.